Hello there, and welcome to Whispered Knowledge. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Perhaps you've had a long day navigating what you thought was reality, or maybe you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to thoughts that gently bend the mind rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is designed especially for you. You have nothing to do but rest. Let your breathing slow, your body settle, and your thoughts drift as we explore something both familiar and utterly strange. Because tonight, we're investigating the very nature of reality itself, or rather, how your brain constructs what you experience as reality. Everything you see, hear, touch, taste, and smell is not a direct window onto an objective world. Instead, your brain is constantly building a model of reality based on incomplete information, past experiences, and predictions about what should happen next. The world you perceive right now is, in a very real sense, a controlled hallucination, a brilliant, useful, adaptive construction that helps you survive and thrive, but a construction nonetheless. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you, or at the very least spark some curiosity as you drift towards sleep. We'll explore optical illusions that reveal the cracks in your perceptual matrix, the mysteries of consciousness itself, and the unsettling fact that your memories are not recordings, but reconstructions that change each time you recall them. And just before we begin, if these calm, curious explorations help you unwind or give you a quiet way to end your day, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin our journey into the constructed world you call reality. The brain as reality constructor. Your brain is not a passive receiver of information from the outside world. It is an active constructor, constantly building your experience from the ground up. Every moment of consciousness is a prediction, a best guess about what is happening, based on sensory signals filtered through layers of expectation, memory, and assumption. This is not a flaw in the system. It is how perception works. Think for a moment about what your brain actually has to work with. It sits inside your skull, completely isolated from the external world. No light reaches it directly. No sound waves touch it. It receives no direct information about the objects and events happening around you. Everything it knows about the world comes indirectly through chains of neural signals originating at your sensory organs. Photons hitting your retina are converted to electrical impulses. Sound waves vibrating your eardrum are converted to electrical impulses. Molecules binding to receptors in your nose are converted to electrical impulses. Your brain is receiving what amounts to a stream of data, patterns of electrical activity arriving through different channels, and from this abstract data stream, it must construct your entire subjective experience of reality. This is an astounding computational feat. The raw sensory data is ambiguous, noisy, and incomplete. A pattern of light on your retina could be caused by an infinite number of different arrangements of objects in three-dimensional space. The sound waves reaching your ears could come from countless different sources. Yet somehow, your brain takes this ambiguous input and constructs a stable, coherent model of the world, one that's accurate enough to let you navigate, manipulate objects, and predict events with remarkable precision. Consider this first fact. All perception is an active construction by the brain. When light enters your eyes, it doesn't simply create an image that your brain passively observes. Instead, photons strike the retina at the back of your eye, where they are converted into electrical signals. These signals travel through the optic nerve to various processing centers in your brain. But even before they arrive at the visual cortex, your brain has already begun making predictions about what those signals mean. It compares incoming data with past experiences, fills in gaps, and constructs a coherent visual scene that feels immediate and direct. But that feeling of directness is itself part of the construction. This predictive processing occurs at every level of perception. Before you even open your eyes in the morning, your brain has predictions about what you'll see. When you reach for a cup of coffee, your brain predicts the weight and temperature before your hand makes contact. When someone begins speaking, your brain predicts what they're going to say, based on context and their speech patterns so far. These predictions happen unconsciously and shape your conscious experience in profound ways. The predictive nature of perception becomes especially clear when predictions fail. Have you ever picked up what you thought was a full cup of coffee, only to discover it was empty? The cup flies upward faster than you expected because your motor system predicted it would be heavy and generated more force than necessary. That moment of surprise, that jarring feeling when reality doesn't match expectation, is your brain detecting a prediction error and rapidly updating its model. Most of the time, predictions succeed, and you never notice them. You only become aware of the predictive process when it fails. Neuroscientists now understand that perception works through both bottom-up and top-down processing. Bottom-up refers to the sensory data flowing from your eyes, ears, and other organs into your brain. This is the stream of raw information coming in from the world. Top-down refers to the expectations, memories, and predictions your brain uses to interpret that data. These are the models and assumptions your brain brings to the sensory input, shaped by everything you've experienced before. These two streams of information meet and merge in your cortex, creating what you experience as reality. When they align, when the bottom-up sensory data matches the top-down predictions, the world seems clear and stable. When they conflict, when sensory input violates your predictions, you experience confusion, illusion, or surprise. The brain constantly makes predictions about incoming sensory information. It has to, because raw sensory data is messy, ambiguous, and arrives with delays. Different senses process information at different speeds. Touch sensations from your feet take longer to reach your consciousness than sensations from your face, simply because the neural signals have farther to travel. Visual processing can be remarkably fast for simple features, while more complex auditory processing takes additional time. Yet somehow, you experience the world as synchronized, as if everything is happening at once. This synchronization is manufactured by your brain, which actively predicts when signals should arrive and backdates your conscious experience to make everything feel simultaneous. This temporal binding is a remarkable feat. Your brain continuously estimates the delays involved in different sensory pathways and adjusts your conscious experience accordingly. When you see lightning and hear thunder, you know they happened at the same moment at the lightning strike, even though the light reached you almost instantaneously, while the sound took seconds to arrive. Your brain can separate these signals in time, but when you watch someone speaking, their lip movements and the sound of their voice are perceived as perfectly synchronized, even though the visual and auditory signals are processed at different speeds and through different pathways. Your brain binds them together into a unified audio-visual experience. The concept of the brain as a prediction machine has revolutionized neuroscience over the past 2 decades. This framework, sometimes called predictive processing or predictive coding, proposes that your brain is not waiting for sensory input to tell it what's happening. Instead, it's constantly generating hypotheses about what should be happening next, and then checking those predictions against incoming data. When predictions match reality, your brain feels confident and doesn't need to update its model. But when predictions fail, when something unexpected happens, your brain takes notice. Surprise is a signal that your internal model needs adjustment. This is why novel experiences feel so vivid and memorable. They represent moments when your brain's predictions failed and required updating. This predictive framework explains many aspects of perception that would otherwise be puzzling. Why do we experience afterimages? Because neurons that have been predicting a certain stimulus become fatigued, and when the stimulus is removed, the opposite prediction briefly dominates. Why is it hard to tickle yourself? Because your brain predicts the sensory consequences of your own movements, cancelling out the expected sensations. But when someone else tickles you, their movements are unpredictable, and the unexpected touches feel much more intense. Why do magicians' illusions work? Because they exploit your brain's predictions, leading you to expect one thing while delivering another, creating surprise and misdirection. Every sensory experience you have is shaped by this predictive process. Colors are not properties of objects in the world, but inventions of your brain. When you see a ripe strawberry as red, you're not detecting redness as a property of the strawberry itself. You're experiencing your brain's interpretation of the wavelengths of light reflecting off the strawberry's surface. The strawberry reflects light of certain wavelengths, absorbed some wavelengths, and bounced others toward your eyes. But redness doesn't exist in those wavelengths. It exists only in your brain's response to them. A camera or a photo detector measuring the same wavelengths would not experience red. It would simply register numerical values corresponding to wavelength frequencies. The qualitative experience of redness, the particular way red looks to you, is something your brain creates. Sounds are not vibrations in the air, but patterns your brain constructs from those vibrations. When you hear a symphony, the air molecules around you are vibrating in complex patterns, creating pressure waves that propagate through space. These pressure waves strike your eardrum, causing it to vibrate. The vibrations are transmitted through tiny bones in your middle ear to fluid in your cochlea, where they cause hair cells to bend. The bending hair cells generate electrical signals that travel to your brain. At no point in this chain is there anything resembling the rich, layered, emotionally moving experience of hearing music. That experience is constructed entirely in your brain, assembled from patterns of neural firing that represent frequency, amplitude, and timing of the original pressure waves. Even your sense of your own body, your proprioception and sense of balance are manufactured internally. You feel your body as a unified whole, with all its parts connected and coordinated. But this feeling is a construction, maintained by continuous integration of sensory signals from muscles, joints, and your inner ear, combined with motor predictions about where your body parts should be, based on recent commands sent to your muscles. People who lose sensory input from a limb through injury or disease can still feel that limb as present and real. This phenomenon, known as phantom limb sensation, affects the majority of amputees. They continue to experience the missing limb as if it was still attached, feeling its position, temperature, and even pain. This demonstrates that your experience of embodiment is generated by your brain's model of your body, not by the body itself. Phantom limb sensations can be quite specific and vivid. An amputee might feel their phantom hand clenching into a fist, or their phantom foot resting at a particular angle. Some report itching in the phantom limb that cannot be scratched, or pain that cannot be relieved. These sensations occur because the brain regions that formerly processed input from the missing limb continue to be active, generating the felt experience of the limb, even though no sensory input is arriving from it. The phantom is real to the person experiencing it, as real as any other bodily sensation, because all bodily sensations are ultimately constructions of the brain, with or without input from the actual body part. The renowned neuroscientist Anil Seth describes consciousness as a controlled hallucination. This might sound alarming at first, suggesting that your entire experience of reality is false or untrustworthy. But the term is meant as a precise description of how perception works, not as a dismissal of its validity. Hallucination refers to the fact that your experience is generated internally, not simply received from outside. Your brain is not like a camera, passively recording whatever is in front of it. Instead, it's actively generating a model of what it thinks is out there, a simulation running in your neural circuits. This simulation is what you experience as reality. Controlled refers to the fact that these internal constructions are constrained and shaped by sensory input, by the actual state of the world. The hallucination is not random or arbitrary. It's controlled by data from your senses, which provides ongoing feedback about whether your brain's model matches what's actually happening. When you see a tree, you're not directly experiencing the tree itself, with all its molecules, cellulose, and chlorophyll. You're experiencing your brain's best guess about what's out there based on patterns of light hitting your retina, combined with your past experience of trees, your expectations about what trees look like, and your current goals and attention. The tree in your experience is a construct, a virtual tree assembled from neural activity patterns. Most of the time, this controlled hallucination matches reality closely enough to be useful. You can walk around the tree without bumping into it. You can predict that it will still be there tomorrow. You can recognize it as a tree and not confuse it with a building or an animal. But sometimes the hallucination diverges from reality, and that's when things get interesting. Optical illusions are moments when the control breaks down, when sensory input is ambiguous enough that your brain's predictions lead it astray. The hallucination becomes less controlled, and you experience something that doesn't match the physical stimulus. Yet, these illusions feel completely real. You cannot simply will yourself to see the illusion differently. Even when you know an illusion is occurring, even when you understand exactly why it's happening, you still experience it. This demonstrates that conscious perception is not under your direct voluntary control. It's the output of unconscious processes that take sensory input and prior knowledge and generate your subjective experience. You can influence these processes indirectly by directing your attention or changing your assumptions, but you cannot directly override them. Your brain lives in a dark, silent box, receiving only electrical signals from your sensory organs. It never directly accesses the world outside. Everything you know about external reality is filtered through this barrier of sensory processing. The signals your brain receives are ambiguous and incomplete. A pattern of light on your retina could be caused by countless different objects or arrangements in the world. Your brain must use prior knowledge to disambiguate, to figure out which interpretation is most likely. This is why your past experiences shape what you perceive in the present. Two people with different life histories can look at the same scene and literally see different things. Research suggests there's a brief processing delay between when sensory input arrives and when it reaches conscious awareness. Estimates vary, but this delay is thought to be somewhere around 1/10 of a second for visual information. This creates an interesting challenge. Your brain may compensate for this delay through predictive processing, potentially helping explain how you can catch a ball or react quickly to moving objects. Some researchers have proposed that your brain essentially predicts the immediate future to keep you functionally engaged with the present moment. One intriguing hypothesis suggests this predictive capacity might even contribute to certain optical illusions, where your brain's expectations about motion or change influence what you consciously perceive. Another fundamental fact about perception is that it involves enormous amounts of unconscious processing. Before anything reaches your conscious awareness, it has been filtered, sorted, enhanced, and interpreted by multiple layers of neural processing. Most of what your brain does never reaches consciousness at all. You're only aware of the final product, the polished construction that feels like direct experience. This means that the phenomenology of perception, the way things seem to you, tells you very little about how perception actually works. It feels like you're directly seeing the world, but you're actually seeing your brain's interpretation of ambiguous sensory signals. The complexity of constructing reality from sensory inputs is staggering. Your visual system alone involves dozens of specialized brain regions, each processing different aspects of the visual scene. Some neurons respond to edges, others to motion, others to color, others to faces. All of this processing happens in parallel and then somehow binds together into a unified conscious experience. Neuroscientists call this the binding problem, and it remains one of the deepest mysteries in the study of consciousness. How does your brain take all these separate processing streams and create a single, coherent experience of seeing? What you perceive is not what is there, but what your brain expects to be there. This becomes especially clear in cases of brain damage or neurological conditions. People with visual form agnosia can see colors and textures perfectly well, but cannot recognize objects. Their visual processing is intact, but the higher level interpretation of shapes has been disrupted. Others experience prosopagnosia, or face blindness, where they can see faces but cannot recognize them as familiar. These conditions reveal that perception is not a single, unified process, but a collection of specialized systems, each contributing to the overall construction of reality. Visual perception and its limits. Your visual system, despite its sophistication, has profound limitations. What you see is not a complete representation of the world, but a narrow slice, filtered through the constraints of your biology. These limitations shape your reality in ways you're usually not aware of. The human eye can only detect a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. This spectrum extends from low-frequency radio waves, with wavelengths measured in meters, through microwaves and infrared, through the visible spectrum, and up through ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays, with wavelengths smaller than atoms. The visible spectrum that you can see occupies a narrow band between about 390 nanometers to 700 nanometers. Everything below ultraviolet and above infrared is invisible to you, even though it's constantly present in your environment. Many animals can see parts of the spectrum that you cannot. Bees can see ultraviolet light, which helps them navigate using patterns on flowers that are invisible to humans. Snakes can sense infrared radiation, allowing them to detect warm-blooded prey in total darkness. Birds may be able to see magnetic fields, giving them an internal compass for navigation. Each species constructs a different perceptual reality based on the sensory systems evolution has given them. Your reality is just one of many possible realities, shaped by the particular senses your ancestors needed to survive. Even within the visible spectrum, your perception is not uniform. Your retina contains two types of photoreceptor cells, rods and cones. Rods are more sensitive to low light and give you peripheral vision, but they don't detect color. Cones come in 3 varieties, each sensitive to different wavelengths we experience as red, green, and blue. These cones are concentrated in a small area at the center of your retina called the fovea. This means you only have high-resolution color vision in a tiny spot about the width of your thumbnail held at arm's length. Everything else in your visual field is processed at much lower resolution. But you don't experience this limited resolution. Your visual field seems uniformly sharp and colorful because your brain fills in the gaps. Your eyes make rapid movements called saccades, darting from point to point several times per second and your brain stitches these snapshots together into a seamless panorama. During the saccades themselves, you're effectively blind, but your brain edits out these gaps so you never notice them. This is part of the filling in process that happens constantly in visual perception. Perhaps the most dramatic example of filling in is your blind spot. Each of your eyes has a region on the retina where the optic nerve exits to carry visual information to the brain. This region contains no photoreceptors, so you have no visual information from that area. The blind spot is not small. It subtends about 5 degrees of visual angle, which in terms of area is considerably larger than you might expect. Yet, under normal circumstances, you never notice it. Your brain fills in the blind spot with whatever visual information surrounds it, creating the illusion of continuous vision. You can experience your blind spot directly with a simple test. Make a dot and a cross on a piece of paper, separated by about 4 inches. Close your right eye and look at the cross with your left eye. As you slowly bring the paper toward your face, the dot will disappear when it falls on your blind spot, then reappear as you continue moving the paper closer. What's remarkable is not that the dot disappears, but that when it does, your brain doesn't show you a blank spot. It fills in that region with the same blank paper that surrounds the dot, making the absence invisible. This filling in process happens everywhere in your visual field, not just at the blind spot. When you look at a scene, you're only actually seeing a small portion of it in detail. The rest is filled in based on expectations and assumptions. This is why you can miss obvious changes in your environment if they happen gradually or during a moment when you're not paying attention. Researchers have documented a phenomenon called change blindness, where people fail to notice substantial alterations to a scene if the change occurs during a visual disruption, like an eye movement or a brief blank screen. Optical illusions exploit the predictive and constructive nature of vision. The famous Canizza triangle shows how your brain will perceive shapes that aren't actually present. When you see 3 Pac-Man-like shapes arranged at the corners of where a triangle would be, your brain fills in the edges of an illusory white triangle, even though no triangle has been drawn. This happens because your visual system has learned that such configurations in the real world are almost always caused by one object partially occluding others. Your brain's prediction of "there's a triangle here" is so strong that you literally see a triangle that doesn't exist. Motion illusions are particularly striking because they reveal the temporal prediction built into vision. Some static patterns appear to rotate or ripple because they trigger motion detection systems in your visual cortex. These neurons are expecting motion based on the patterns they detect, and so they signal motion even though the image is stationary. Looking at the center of these illusions often intensifies the effect, causing the apparent motion to speed up. This happens because your visual system uses eye movements and attention to update its predictions, and when you fixate on a spot, certain prediction errors amplify. The Hermann grid illusion demonstrates another aspect of visual construction. When you look at a grid of black squares on a white background, you may see dark spots appear and disappear at the intersections of the white lines. These spots aren't there in the image. For decades, these ghostly gray spots were thought to result from lateral inhibition in your retina, where neurons suppress the activity of neighboring neurons. However, more recent research has challenged this explanation, as certain variations of the grid don't produce the expected illusions. If lateral inhibition were the only factor, the spots tend to disappear when you look directly at them, appearing instead in your peripheral vision where resolution is lower, suggesting the phenomenon involves complex interactions in visual processing that researchers are still working to fully understand. Color constancy is another example of your brain actively constructing perception rather than passively receiving it. An apple appears red whether you're looking at it in bright sunlight, in the shade, or under artificial light, even though the actual wavelengths of light reflecting from the apple change dramatically in these different conditions. Your brain adjusts for lighting conditions automatically, maintaining consistent color perception across vast changes in illumination. This ability breaks down in certain circumstances, leading to phenomena like the famous dress debate of 2015, where people vehemently disagreed about whether a photograph showed a blue and black dress or a white and gold dress. The disagreement arose because different people made different unconscious assumptions about the lighting conditions in the photograph. The scintillating grid illusion is a more intense version of the Hermann grid. It shows a regular grid of white circles on black lines, and when you look near, but not directly at any intersection, dark spots seem to flash and scintillate at the intersections. The effect is so strong that some people find it uncomfortable to look at for extended periods. Again, this reveals the active, predictive nature of vision. Your brain is not simply recording what's there, but constantly making predictions and adjustments based on contrast, edges, and motion. Research into visual illusions has revealed that our brains can adapt their predictions based on repeated exposure. If you stare at a particular stimulus for a prolonged period, neurons tuned to that stimulus begin to fatigue. This neural fatigue creates adaptation effects, where your perception of subsequent stimuli is distorted. For instance, if you stare at a waterfall for 30 seconds and then look at a stationary rock, the rock will briefly appear to be moving upward. This waterfall illusion occurs because the motion-detecting neurons tuned to downward motion have fatigued, allowing neurons tuned to upward motion to dominate temporarily. The moon illusion is a perceptual phenomenon known to humanity for thousands of years. The moon appears much larger when it's near the horizon than when it's high in the sky, even though the actual size of the moon's image on your retina doesn't change. Various explanations have been proposed over the centuries, and the phenomenon likely involves multiple factors working together. One prominent idea suggests it relates to how your brain interprets distance and size. When the moon is near the horizon, you have reference points, like buildings and trees, that may influence your brain's distance estimates. When it's high in the sky, these reference points are absent, and your brain size calculations change. This shows that your perception of size is not determined solely by the retinal image, but by contextual information and learned relationships between distance cues and apparent size. The Ponzo illusion works on similar principles. Two identical horizontal lines placed between converging lines, like railroad tracks receding into the distance, appear to be different sizes. The line that appears farther away looks larger, even though both lines are identical. Your brain has learned that parallel lines, like railroad tracks, converge in the visual field due to perspective. When you see convergence, your brain interprets it as depth and then adjusts size perception accordingly. The farther object must be larger to create the same size retinal image, so your brain makes it look larger in your conscious experience. The Muller-Lyer illusion is another classic demonstration of how context affects size perception. Two lines of identical length, one with arrow fins pointing inward and one with fins pointing outward, appear to be different lengths. The line with outward pointing fins looks longer. Researchers have proposed several explanations for this effect. One theory suggests the inward pointing fins resemble the corner of a room, viewed from inside, while the outward pointing fins resemble the corner of a building viewed from outside, and these learned associations with three-dimensional space influence how we perceive two-dimensional lines. However, the illusion also occurs in cultures with different architectural experience. suggesting other factors may be at play as well. Time perception. Time, like space, is not simply received by your brain, but actively constructed. Your subjective experience of duration can stretch or compress depending on context, attention, and emotion. The mechanisms your brain uses to perceive time remain mysterious, but research has begun to reveal some of the principles involved. The specious present is a concept introduced by philosopher William James to describe the duration of time that feels like now. When you experience a moment, you're not experiencing a mathematical instant with zero duration, but rather a brief window of time that feels present. This window is thought to last somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds. Events within this window feel like they're happening now. Events outside it feel like they're in the past or future. This specious present is not a fixed feature of time itself, but a construction of your brain, which integrates sensory information over a brief window to create a coherent sense of the present moment. Simultaneity, the experience of multiple events happening at the same time, is also constructed. As mentioned earlier, different sensory signals take different amounts of time to reach your brain and be processed. Sound waves travel slowly through air, so there's a delay between when something makes a sound and when the sound reaches your ears. Light travels much faster, but visual processing in your brain is complex and takes time. Touch sensations from distant parts of your body must travel different distances along neurons to reach your brain. Despite all these different delays, your brain synchronizes these signals so that you experience events as happening simultaneously when they occur together in the world. The perception of duration is highly malleable. Time seems to pass more quickly when you're engaged in an enjoyable activity and more slowly when you're bored or waiting for something. This is partly due to attention. When you're focused on a task, you have fewer cognitive resources available to monitor the passage of time, and so time seems to pass quickly. When you're bored, you have excess cognitive capacity, and you notice time passing more acutely, making it seem slower. Emotion also affects time perception. When you're afraid, time seems to slow down. This effect is so consistent that it's been replicated in laboratory studies. People shown frightening images tend to overestimate how long the images were displayed. The mechanism may involve the amygdala, a brain structure involved in processing fear. Activation of the amygdala seems to increase the rate of an internal timing mechanism, making external events appear to last longer. This could be evolutionarily adaptive. If you're in danger, having a dilated sense of time gives you more subjective time to assess the situation and respond. The phenomenon is sometimes called the oddball effect. A surprising or salient stimulus in a sequence of regular stimuli seems to last longer than it actually does. For instance, if you're shown a sequence of neutral faces and then there's suddenly a fearful face, the fearful face seems to be displayed longer than the neutral ones, even when all faces are shown for the same duration. This happens because your brain allocates more attention to unexpected or emotionally salient events, and increased attention is associated with expanded time perception. Retrospective time judgments differ from prospective ones. When you're asked to judge how long something lasted while you're experiencing it, you make a prospective judgment. When you're asked to remember how long something lasted after it's over, you make a retrospective judgment. These two types of judgments often differ. Prospective judgments tend to be more accurate, but are influenced by how much attention you're paying to time itself. Retrospective judgments are more influenced by memory. You tend to judge duration based on how many distinct memories you form during the period. A period packed with novel experiences will be remembered as lasting longer than an equally long period of routine activities, because the novel period generated more distinct memories. This explains why time seems to speed up as you age. When you're young, almost everything is novel. You're constantly forming new memories and learning new things. Each day feels long because it's packed with distinct experiences. As you age, you fall into routines. Days become similar to each other. Fewer novel memories are encoded. When you look back on a month or a year, it feels like it passed quickly because you have fewer distinct memories from that period. The actual passage of time hasn't changed, but your memory of it has compressed. The perceived speeding up of time with age is also related to proportionality. When you're 10 years old, 1 year represents 10% of your entire life. When you're 50 years old, 1 year represents only 2% of your life. Psychologically, each year becomes a smaller fraction of your total experience, which may make it feel less significant and thus shorter in retrospect. Neural adaptation affects time perception. Repeated exposure to a stimulus causes the neurons responsive to that stimulus to fatigue. This neural fatigue changes your subsequent time perception. In experiments, if participants are shown a visual stimulus for a specific duration many times in a row, the neurons tuned to that duration begin to fatigue. When participants are then shown a slightly different duration, their perception is dragged away from the adapted duration. If they adapted to 450 milliseconds and then see a 500 millisecond duration, they'll perceive it as lasting even longer than 500 milliseconds because the neurons tuned to 450 are fatigued. The parietal cortex appears to play a crucial role in temporal perception. Brain imaging studies show increased activity in the right parietal cortex when people are asked to judge durations. Damage to this area can impair time perception, causing people to underestimate or overestimate durations. However, time perception is not localized to a single brain region. Different timescales seem to involve different neural mechanisms. Very short durations, less than a second, may be processed by sensory cortices and the cerebellum. Longer durations, from seconds to minutes, may involve prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia circuits that include dopamine signaling. The internal clock model is one theoretical framework for understanding time perception. It proposes that your brain might contain something like a pacemaker that generates regular pulses, and duration is judged by counting these pulses. The more pulses that occur during an interval, the longer that interval would be perceived to be. According to this model, factors like arousal, attention, and emotion could affect either the rate of the pacemaker or the efficiency of counting pulses, leading to distortions in perceived duration. However, this model has its limitations and may oversimplify what actually happens. More recent theories suggest that time perception might arise from the dynamics of neural activity itself, rather than from a dedicated internal clock, with different patterns of neural firing serving as temporal signatures. The stopped clock illusion demonstrates another oddity of time perception. When you first look at a clock with a second hand, the first tick often seems to last longer than subsequent ticks. This chronostasis occurs because your brain backdates the start of your perception to compensate for the time it took to move your eyes and process the new visual information. The first second you see actually includes the time during which you are moving your eyes, but your brain fills in that period with an extended perception of the clock's initial position, making it seem like that second lasted extra long. Time perception can be manipulated experimentally in other ways. Increasing body temperature tends to speed up the internal clock, causing people to underestimate durations. Decreasing body temperature has the opposite effect. Various drugs also affect time perception. Stimulants like caffeine and amphetamines tend to speed up the internal clock, making durations feel shorter. Depressants like alcohol tend to slow it down, making durations feel longer. Psychedelic drugs can profoundly distort time perception, sometimes causing people to feel like time has stopped entirely, or that they've experienced hours or days during what was actually a brief period. The flow of time, the sense that time is constantly moving forward, is itself a construction. Physicists describe time as a dimension similar to space, where past, present, and future all exist equally. The special status of now and the feeling that time flows may be features of consciousness rather than features of time itself. Your brain creates this flow by constantly updating its predictions and integrating new sensory information with recent memories. The arrow of time, the fact that cause precedes effect and entropy increases, gives direction to these updates, but the feeling of flow is manufactured by your cognitive processes, color, and the invented world. Color is not a property of light or of objects in the world. It is a creation of your brain, a way of categorizing and keeping track of different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. This was first recognized clearly by Isaac Newton in the 17th century, though the full implications took centuries to appreciate. When white light passes through a prism, it separates into a rainbow of colors. Newton realized that these colors were not created by the prism, but were already present in the white light, just mixed together. He also realized that color is not an inherent property of light itself, but something that arises in the interaction between light and the observer. Light is just electromagnetic radiation at different wavelengths. Color is your brain's way of representing those wavelengths. The wavelengths you perceive as red are longer, around 700 nanometers. The wavelengths you perceive as violet are shorter, around 400 nanometers. In between are orange, yellow, green, and blue. But this mapping from wavelength to color is not one-to-one. Two very different physical stimuli can produce the same color experience, a phenomenon called metamerism. Your eye contains 3 types of cones, each sensitive to different ranges of wavelengths. Any combination of wavelengths that stimulates these 3 cone types in the same proportion will produce the same color experience, even if the physical spectra are completely different. This means that your perception of color is inherently ambiguous. The same object can look different colors under different lighting conditions, because the light reflecting from it changes. Conversely, different objects can look the same color under certain conditions because they produce the same cone responses. Your brain tries to solve this ambiguity through color constancy, automatically adjusting for lighting conditions to keep objects looking consistently colored, but this process can fail, leading to disagreements about what color something is. The dress photograph that went viral in 2015 is a perfect example of this failure. Some people saw the dress as white and gold, others as blue and black. Both groups were adamant that their perception was correct. The photograph was ambiguous about the lighting conditions, and different people made different unconscious assumptions. Those who assumed the dress was in shadow saw it as white and gold. Those who assumed it was in bright light saw it as blue and black. Both interpretations were consistent with the image, but led to completely different color experiences. Not everyone sees color the same way. About 8% of men and about 0.5% of women have some form of color vision deficiency, often called color blindness. The most common form is red-green color blindness, where one of the cone types is missing or dysfunctional, making it difficult to distinguish reds from greens. People with this condition literally see a different palette of colors than those with normal color vision. Their reality is colored differently. Even among people with normal color vision, there are individual differences. The exact sensitivities of your cone cells vary slightly from person to person. Your past experiences also influence how you perceive and categorize colors. Different cultures have different numbers of basic color terms and draw boundaries between colors in different places. Some languages have a single word that encompasses what English speakers call blue and green. Speakers of these languages may perceive that region of the spectrum as more unified than English speakers do. The color you perceive is also influenced by context. A gray patch surrounded by red will appear slightly greenish, while the same gray patch surrounded by green will appear slightly reddish. This simultaneous contrast occurs because your visual system enhances boundaries and differences. When you see red, neurons detecting green are suppressed, making adjacent areas look greener. This context dependency means that there's no such thing as an absolute color perception. Every color you see is influenced by the colors around it. Color constancy is an impressive feat of neural computation. The light reflecting from an object changes dramatically depending on whether it's in sunlight, shade, or artificial light. Yet, you perceive the object as having a constant color. Your brain achieves this by comparing the light coming from the object with the light coming from the rest of the scene, inferring the lighting conditions, and then discounting the effects of that lighting to estimate the object's true surface color. This process usually works well, but it can be fooled by unusual lighting or by carefully constructed ambiguous images. After images demonstrate that color is constructed in your brain, not in the world. Stare at a bright colored shape for 30 seconds, then look at a blank white surface. You'll see a ghostly after image of the shape in the complementary color. If the original was red, the after image will be green. This happens because the cone cells sensitive to red become fatigued from the prolonged stimulation. When you then look at white light, which normally stimulates all cone types equally, the red cones respond less strongly than the green and blue cones, creating the perception of green. The evolution of color vision in primates is thought to be related to foraging. Being able to distinguish red and orange fruits from green leaves provided an advantage, allowing our ancestors to identify ripe fruit more easily. The three-cone system we have may represent an optimal balance between the costs of maintaining color vision and its benefits. Some birds have 4 types of cones and can see a richer color palette than we can, including colors in the ultraviolet range that are completely outside our experience. Interestingly, color is processed separately from other visual features like shape and motion. Brain damage can selectively impair color vision while leaving other aspects of vision intact, a condition called achromatopsia. People with complete achromatopsia see the world in grayscale, like a black and white photograph. They can see shapes, motion, and depth perfectly well, but have no experience of color. This shows that color is not an automatic consequence of vision, but a specific construction that can be removed, leaving other aspects of visual experience intact. Some philosophers and scientists have debated whether your experience of red is the same as another person's experience of red. This is called the problem of inverted qualia. Maybe when you look at something red, you have the same internal experience that I have when I look at something green, and vice versa. As long as we both learn the same color labels applied to the same objects, we'd never know our internal experiences were inverted. This thought experiment reveals that subjective experience is private and potentially incommensurable between individuals. Color is one of the clearest examples of how your brain constructs qualities that aren't in the world itself. Wavelength is in the world. Color is in your mind. And because color is constructed, it can vary between individuals and be manipulated by context. Every time you see a color, you're witnessing your brain's solution to the problem of categorizing and tracking electromagnetic radiation. It's a useful fiction, a constructed reality that allows you to navigate the world effectively, but a fiction nonetheless. Memory As regards to reconstruction, memory feels like a recording, a playback of past events that allows you to relive what happened. But this feeling is misleading. Memory is not a recording, but a reconstruction. Each time you remember something, you rebuild it from fragments, filling in gaps with inferences and expectations. This reconstructive process makes memory vulnerable to distortion and error. The idea that memory is reconstructive was proposed by psychologist Frederick Bartlett in the 1930s. He had participants read folk tales from unfamiliar cultures and then recall them later. He found that people's retellings were systematically distorted. Details that didn't fit with their cultural expectations were forgotten or changed. The stories were regularized, made more conventional and more familiar. Bartlett concluded that memory is not a passive storage system, but an active process of reconstruction, guided by schemas, mental frameworks that organize knowledge. Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues provided some of the most dramatic demonstrations of memory's malleability. In one classic study, participants watched a video of a car accident. Afterward, some were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other, while others were asked how fast they were going when they hit each other. Those who heard the word smashed gave higher speed estimates. Even more striking, a week later, participants who had heard smashed were more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass in the video, even though there was no broken glass. A single word in a question was enough to alter their memories. This misinformation effect has been replicated countless times. If you experience an event and then are exposed to misleading information about that event, the misleading information can become incorporated into your memory. You may later remember the false information as if you had actually witnessed it. This has profound implications for eyewitness testimony in legal settings. Witnesses can be genuinely confident in memories that have been unconsciously altered by leading questions or exposure to other witnesses' accounts. False memories can be even more elaborate. In studies known as the Lost in the Mall experiments and similar research, investigators have succeeded in implanting entirely false childhood memories in a notable portion of participants. The researchers work with participants' family members to identify a plausible but false event, such as getting lost in a shopping mall at age 5. They then interview the participant about this event over several sessions, encouraging them to try to remember details. In some of these studies, roughly 20 to 30% of participants developed a false memory of the event, complete with sensory details and emotional responses. They're not lying. They genuinely believe they remember something that never happened. The exact percentages vary across different studies, depending on the specific methods used and the plausibility of the suggested event. Even more striking, researchers have conducted studies examining whether false memories of committing crimes could be created. In one well-known study by Shaw and Porter, a significant percentage of participants developed false memories of having committed theft, assault, or assault with a weapon during adolescence, complete with detailed descriptions. The study used repeated questioning, social pressure techniques, and visualization exercises to encourage the formation of these memories. While these findings demonstrate the malleability of memory under certain experimental conditions, it's important to note that creating such memories required intensive, repeated sessions with specific suggestive techniques. The percentage who developed these false memories varied across participants and crime types, with the researchers noting that not all participants were equally susceptible to suggestion. Confabulation is a phenomenon related to false memory, but typically more dramatic. It occurs in certain neurological conditions, such as Korsakoff's syndrome, caused by chronic alcoholism and vitamin deficiency. People with confabulation produce false memories without any intention to deceive. They genuinely believe the false memories they report. In some cases, the confabulations are mundane, filling in gaps in memory with plausible but incorrect details. In other cases, they're bizarre and obviously impossible. A person might claim to have been on the moon, or to have met a historical figure who died before they were born. Confabulation appears to result from a combination of memory deficits and executive dysfunction. The memory deficits mean that accurate information is unavailable. The executive dysfunction means that the person cannot effectively monitor and evaluate the plausibility of what they're remembering. Without this monitoring, they accept implausible or impossible memories as true. In a sense, confabulation is an extreme version of the reconstructive process that characterizes all memory. The difference is that in healthy memory, reconstruction is constrained by enough accurate details and by effective reality monitoring. Source monitoring is the process by which you determine where a memory came from. Did you see something yourself, or did someone tell you about it? Did you do something, or did you just imagine doing it? Most of the time, source monitoring works well, but it can fail, especially for events that occurred long ago or that you've thought about many times. Each time you retrieve a memory, you reconstruct it, and that reconstruction can incorporate elements from imagination, from other people's accounts, or from other memories. Over time, these source confusions can become permanent so that you're unable to distinguish what really happened from what you imagined or were told. The misinformation effect works partly through source confusion. When you hear a misleading detail about an event you witnessed, that detail becomes associated with your memory of the event. Later, when you try to remember the event, you retrieve both the original memory and the misleading detail, but you may not remember where the misleading detail came from. It feels like part of your original experience. Source monitoring fails, and the false information is incorporated into your memory. Sleep affects memory consolidation. After you learn something, your memory of it is initially fragile. Over time, especially during sleep, the memory becomes more stable through a process called consolidation. During consolidation, the memory is replayed and strengthened. However, this process is also an opportunity for distortion. Memories that are repeatedly consolidated may become more coherent and more confident, but not necessarily more accurate. Each replay is another reconstruction, another chance for error to creep in. Emotion enhances some aspects of memory but distorts others. Emotionally arousing events are generally remembered better than neutral events. This makes evolutionary sense. Events that evoke strong emotions are likely to be important, so it's adaptive to remember them well. However, emotional arousal leads to a trade-off. Central details of emotional events, the gist of what happened, are remembered well, but peripheral details are often forgotten or distorted. Stress hormones released during emotional events enhance consolidation of central information while impairing processing of peripheral details. Flashbulb memories are vivid memories of surprising and emotionally significant events. Many people have flashbulb memories of where they were and what they were doing when they heard about major news events like the September 11th attacks. These memories feel incredibly vivid and accurate, as if they've been permanently etched into the brain. However, research shows that flashbulb memories are no more accurate than ordinary memories, despite their vividness. When people's flashbulb memories are tested against records made shortly after the event, the memories often contain substantial errors and distortions. Vividness and confidence do not guarantee accuracy. Repeated retrieval changes memories. Each time you remember an event, you're not simply reading out a stored record. You're reconstructing the memory from fragments and then restoring it. This process, called reconsolidation, means that memories are vulnerable to modification every time they're accessed. Details can be added, removed, or altered. Emotions associated with the memory can intensify or fade. Over time and multiple retrievals, a memory can drift substantially from the original event, even while remaining vivid and feeling accurate. The confidence you have in a memory is not a good indicator of its accuracy. People can be extremely confident in memories that are completely false. The factors that increase confidence, such as vividness, detail, and repeated retrieval, do not necessarily increase accuracy. In fact, repeatedly imagining an event or repeatedly hearing about it can increase your confidence that it happened, even if it didn't. This is called imagination inflation. Simply imagining an event makes it feel more familiar, and familiarity is often misinterpreted as evidence that the event actually occurred. Memory's reconstructive nature means that there is no sharp line between remembering and imagining. Both processes involve constructing a mental scenario based on fragments of information. The main difference is that remembering includes a sense of pastness, a feeling that the scenario corresponds to something that actually happened. But this feeling can attach to imagined or suggested events, leading to false memories that are phenomenologically indistinguishable from true ones. The implications are profound. Your personal history, the story of your life that feels so solid and real, is partly fiction. Not deliberate fiction, but honest reconstruction that has drifted from the truth over years of retelling, both to others and to yourself. The person you remember being 10 years ago is not exactly the person you were. The events that define your identity may have happened differently than you remember. Your past is not fixed, but constantly being rewritten by your present self, shaped by your current beliefs, emotions, and identity. You are, in a sense, a narrator creating your own story, and like any story, it's a blend of fact and invention. The hard problem of consciousness. Consciousness is perhaps the deepest mystery in science and philosophy. We know what it's like to be conscious, to have subjective experiences, to feel what philosophers call qualia, but we don't know how or why these subjective experiences arise from physical processes in the brain. This is called the hard problem of consciousness. The term was coined by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995. He distinguished between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems, despite their name, are not actually easy. They're just the kind of problems that seem solvable in principle using standard scientific methods. These include explaining how the brain integrates information, how it controls behavior, how attention works, and how we report on our mental states. These are problems about function and mechanism. The hard problem is different. It asks why any of these functions are accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there something it's like to see red, to feel pain, to hear a symphony? Why doesn't all this processing happen in the dark, with no inner experience, no consciousness? A hypothetical being that behaved exactly like a conscious human but had no inner experience is called a philosophical zombie. The hard problem asks why we're not all zombies. Qualia are the individual instances of subjective experience. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the particular quality of middle C played on a piano. These felt qualities seem irreducible. You can describe the physical properties of light at 700 nanometers, the neural circuits activated when that light hits your retina, the brain regions involved in processing color. But none of this explains the subjective experience of red. There seems to be an explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. The knowledge argument, proposed by philosopher Frank Jackson, dramatizes this gap. Imagine a neuroscientist named Mary. who has lived her entire life in a black and white room. She's never seen color, but she's an expert on color vision. She knows everything there is to know scientifically about how color perception works, which wavelengths correspond to which colors, which neural circuits are activated, everything. Now, suppose Mary leaves her room and sees color for the first time. Does she learn something new? Most people's intuition is yes. She learns what red looks like. She gains a new kind of knowledge by acquaintance with the quail itself, that she couldn't have had from purely scientific understanding. Thomas Nagel made a similar argument with his famous paper, What is it like to be a bat? Bats navigate using echolocation, producing ultrasonic calls and listening to the echoes. This gives them a kind of spatial perception that is fundamentally different from human vision. Nagel argued that no amount of objective knowledge about bat neurophysiology could tell us what echolocation feels like from the inside, what it's like to be a bat. There is an irreducible subjective character to experience that eludes objective description. Some philosophers and scientists argue that the hard problem is a pseudo-problem based on confused thinking. Daniel Dennett, for instance, argues that qualia, understood as intrinsic, private, ineffable properties of experience, don't actually exist. What we call qualia are actually just patterns of information processing that have certain functional properties. Once we fully explain the functions, there's nothing left to explain. The feeling that there's something more, some irreducible subjective quality, is an illusion. Others take the hard problem seriously, but propose physicalist solutions. Perhaps subjective experience emerges from certain types of information processing. Global workspace theory, for instance, proposes that consciousness arises when information is broadcast to a global workspace in the brain, making it available to multiple cognitive systems. Integrated information theory proposes that consciousness is identical to integrated information, and that any system that integrates information in the right way would be conscious, including potentially artificial systems. Still others embrace dualism, the view that consciousness is not physical and cannot be explained purely in terms of brain processes. This view has fallen out of favor in neuroscience and philosophy because it's hard to see how a non-physical mind could interact with a physical brain. But dualism has never been conclusively refuted, and some philosophers and scientists continue to defend versions of it. Panpsychism is an alternative view gaining renewed attention. It proposes that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present to some degree in all matter. Complex consciousness like ours would then arise from the combination and organization of simpler forms of consciousness. This avoids having consciousness suddenly emerge from non-conscious matter, but it raises its own difficult questions about how simple consciousnesses combine. The hard problem highlights limits to our current scientific understanding. We've made tremendous progress in explaining how the brain works, in mapping neural circuits, and identifying the correlates of conscious states. But correlation is not explanation. Knowing that activity in certain brain regions correlates with the experience of seeing red doesn't tell us why that activity feels like something. Some researchers propose that solving the hard problem will require a radically new kind of theory, perhaps a new mathematical framework, or a new way of thinking about information and causation. Others suggest that the hard problem may be unsolvable for humans, that our cognitive architecture simply isn't capable of understanding how subjective experience arises from physical processes. Just as a dog cannot understand quantum mechanics, we may be constitutionally incapable of understanding consciousness. Regardless of whether the hard problem has a solution, its existence has important implications for how we think about reality and perception. It suggests that subjective experience may be a fundamental aspect of reality that cannot be reduced to or explained, in terms of more basic physical processes. Your inner life, your stream of consciousness, your felt experience of being you, may not be merely the product of neural firing patterns. There may be something irreducibly subjective about consciousness that lies beyond the reach of objective science. The relationship between consciousness and the brain remains mysterious. We know they're deeply connected. Brain damage can alter or eliminate conscious experience. Anesthesia can temporarily switch consciousness off and on again. Yet the nature of this connection, why these particular brain processes give rise to these particular experiences, remains unexplained. The mystery deepens when we consider that our conscious experience is unified. You experience yourself as a single, continuous self, perceiving a unified world. Yet, your brain consists of billions of neurons organized into dozens of specialized regions, each processing different aspects of sensory information in parallel. How does this distributed parallel processing give rise to unified consciousness? This is called the binding problem, and it remains unsolved. Synesthesia and cross-modal perception. In most people, the senses remain distinct. You see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and there's no confusion between the two. But in synesthesia, the boundaries between senses blur. A synesthete might see colors when hearing music, taste shapes, or feel touch sensations when watching someone else being touched. Synesthesia reveals the arbitrary nature of how the brain organizes sensory information. The word synesthesia comes from Greek roots, meaning joined perception. It was first described scientifically in the late 19th century, though it has probably existed throughout human history. For many years, synesthesia was considered extremely rare, with early estimates suggesting perhaps fewer than 1 in 20,000 people experienced it. However, more recent research using objective tests and broader sampling methods has revealed it may be far more common than once thought. Some studies suggest prevalence rates closer to 1 in 20 people may experience at least one form of synesthesia, though estimates vary considerably depending on how strictly the condition is defined and what testing methods are used. The most common form is grapheme color synesthesia, where letters and numbers evoke consistent color experiences. A synesthete with this form might always see the letter A as red, B as blue, and so on. These associations are automatic, involuntary, and stable over time. If you ask a grapheme color synesthete what color the letter A is years apart, they'll give the same answer. Non-synesthetes might have personal associations between letters and colors, but these tend to be inconsistent and require effort to recall. Music color synesthesia, also called chromesthesia, involves seeing colors in response to sounds. Different musical notes, timbres, or harmonies evoke different colors. The composer Franz Liszt reportedly had this form of synesthesia and would describe his musical compositions in terms of color. Some synesthetes see colors moving in space as music plays, creating a kind of visual symphony. Lexical gustatory synesthesia involves tasting words. Hearing or reading certain words automatically evokes taste sensations. One well-studied synesthete reported that the word jail tasted like bacon, while Miami tasted like mashed potatoes. These associations are consistent over time and can't be suppressed, though they don't always seem to follow any logical pattern. Mirror touch synesthesia involves feeling tactile sensations when watching someone else being touched. If a mirror touch synesthete sees someone being tapped on the shoulder, they feel a touch on their own shoulder. This can make watching videos of people being injured distressing, as they feel a phantom version of the other person's pain. Brain imaging studies show that watching touch activates the synesthete's somatosensory cortex, the brain region that processes touch, even though they're not actually being touched. The neural basis of synesthesia is still being investigated, and researchers continue to explore various mechanisms that might explain it. Current evidence suggests it may involve increased or different patterns of connectivity between brain regions that are normally more separate. In grapheme color synesthesia, for instance, brain imaging studies have shown enhanced communication between regions that process letter shapes and regions that process color. One hypothesis proposes this could result from differences in how neural connections are pruned during development. Normally, the infant brain has many more connections than the adult brain, and a significant number are eliminated during childhood through a process called synaptic pruning. If this pruning process follows a different pattern in certain areas, it might leave additional connections that allow information from one sensory modality to activate another. However, this remains an active area of research, and the complete picture likely involves multiple factors. Synesthesia runs in families, suggesting a genetic component. If you have synesthesia, your relatives are more likely to have it too, though not necessarily the same form. The associations themselves, like which letter evokes which color, may be learned during childhood, possibly influenced by colored alphabet, books, or refrigerator magnets. But the capacity to form these automatic cross-modal associations appears to be innate. Interestingly, synesthesia is associated with other cognitive traits. Synesthetes tend to have enhanced memory, particularly for the domain affected by their synesthesia. A grapheme color synesthete might have an exceptional memory for numbers, because each number is enriched with color information. Synesthesia is also more common among artists, musicians, and creative individuals, though it's unclear whether synesthesia enhances creativity or whether creative people are more likely to notice and appreciate their synesthetic experiences. Drug-induced synesthesia can occur with psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. People report seeing sounds or hearing colors during psychedelic trips. This temporary synesthesia may result from the drug's effects on serotonin receptors, which are widely distributed throughout the brain and normally help maintain distinct sensory processing channels. By disrupting these channels, psychedelics may allow crosstalk between sensory modalities. Synesthesia demonstrates that the segregation of senses is not absolute, but is actively maintained by the brain. In everyone, there's more crosstalk between sensory modalities than we realize. The ventriloquism effect is an example. When you see a puppet's mouth move and hear the ventriloquist's voice, you perceive the voice as coming from the puppet, even though it's actually coming from a different location. Your brain combines visual and auditory information, and vision biases your perception of where the sound is coming from. The McGurk effect is another example of cross-modal interaction. If you watch a video where someone is saying Baba, but the audio has been replaced with Gaga, you perceive something in between, often da-da. Your brain automatically integrates visual information about lip movements with auditory information about the sound, and when they conflict, you experience a perceptual compromise. You can't stop this integration even when you know about the effect and are trying to perceive the sound accurately. The rubber hand illusion shows how touch and vision interact to create your sense of embodiment. If a rubber hand is placed in front of you while your real hand is hidden, and both the rubber hand and your real hand are simultaneously stroked with a brush, you'll begin to feel as though the rubber hand is your own hand. When someone threatens the rubber hand with a knife, you'll flinch. Your brain has incorporated the rubber hand into your body schema based on the synchrony between visual and tactile information. These cross-modal interactions reveal that your senses are not independent channels delivering separate information to consciousness. Instead, The brain actively combines information from multiple senses to construct a unified perceptual experience. Synesthesia is an extreme version of this normal process, where the cross-modal connections are stronger and more specific, creating conscious experiences that cross sensory boundaries, attention, and reality. Your perceptual reality at any moment is determined not just by sensory input, but by attention. You can't consciously perceive everything in your sensory field at once. Attention selects a small subset of available information for detailed processing and conscious awareness. Everything else is processed at a lower level or ignored entirely. This means that attention shapes your reality, determining what you're conscious of and what remains invisible. Inattentional blindness is the failure to notice unexpected objects or events when your attention is focused elsewhere. The most famous demonstration is the invisible gorilla experiment. Participants watch a video of people passing basketballs and are asked to count how many times the players wearing white shirts pass the ball. During the video, someone in a gorilla suit walks into the scene, beats their chest, and walks off. About half of participants don't notice the gorilla at all. They're so focused on counting passes that they completely miss an event that would normally be impossible to overlook. This is not a failure of vision. The image of the gorilla projects onto the viewer's retinas. The information is there. But without attention, it doesn't reach conscious awareness. The gorilla is effectively invisible despite being clearly present in the visual field. This demonstrates that seeing is not the same as noticing. You only consciously see what you attend to. Change blindness is related to inattentional blindness. When people are shown two versions of an image with substantial differences between them, they often fail to notice the changes, especially if the transition between images is masked by a brief flicker or eye movement. The change can be large, like a building disappearing, or a person's shirt changing color, and people still miss it. This happens because you don't actually maintain a detailed representation of the entire visual scene in memory. You attend to parts of it and assume the rest remains stable. If something changes in an unattended area, you don't detect it. The cocktail party effect demonstrates selective auditory attention. At a noisy party with multiple conversations happening simultaneously, you can focus on one conversation and effectively filter out the others. This selective attention is so effective that you may not notice even salient information from the unattended conversations. In classic experiments, when people focus on a voice in one ear through headphones, they fail to notice that the voice in the other ear switches to a different language, or even plays the message backwards. However, they do notice if someone says their own name in the unattended ear. This shows that unattended information is processed to some degree, enough to detect personally relevant information, but most of it doesn't reach consciousness. Attentional blink occurs in the temporal domain rather than spatial. If you're watching a rapid stream of images and you have to detect two targets, you often miss the second target if it appears within about half a second of the first one. Having detected the first target, your attention is still tied up processing it, and during this brief period, you're effectively blind to other targets. This temporal bottleneck shows that attention is a limited resource that must be allocated over time. Visual search tasks reveal how attention works. When you're looking for a specific object among distractors, your search is efficient if the target has a unique feature, like a red item among green items. Your attention can find it quickly through parallel processing. But if the target requires combining features, like finding a red square among red circles and blue squares, the search becomes inefficient. You must search serially, checking items one by one, and search time increases with the number of distractors. This shows that attention works differently for simple features versus complex feature combinations. Attention is often compared to a spotlight, illuminating one area of the perceptual field while leaving others in shadow. But this metaphor is imperfect. Attention is more flexible than a spotlight suggests. You can divide attention between multiple locations, though with reduced efficiency. You can also expand or narrow the focus of attention depending on task demands. And attention operates not just on spatial locations, but on objects, features, and even abstract categories. Exogenous attention is captured by salient stimuli automatically, without your intention. A sudden movement, a bright flash, or a loud noise will grab your attention, even if you're trying to focus on something else. This automatic capture is adaptive because it helps you detect potential threats or important changes in your environment, but it can also be distracting, pulling attention away from your current goals. Endogenous attention is voluntary, controlled by your intentions and goals. When you decide to focus on reading this text, you're deploying endogenous attention. This type of attention requires cognitive effort to maintain, especially in the presence of distractors. The ability to sustain endogenous attention is a key component of executive function and self-control. Attention affects not just what you're conscious of, but also how you perceive it. Attended stimuli appear brighter, more saturated in color, higher in contrast. This is not just a matter of seeming, where you judge attended objects as having these properties. The perceptual experience itself is enhanced by attention. Brain imaging studies show that attention modulates activity in early sensory cortices, boosting the neural responses to attended stimuli. The attentional blink and other limitations show that consciousness has a narrow bandwidth. You can only be consciously aware of a small amount of information at any given moment. The rest is processed unconsciously or not at all. This means that at every moment, your conscious reality is a tiny sample of available information, selected by attention according to your goals and the salience of stimuli. You live in a spotlight of awareness, surrounded by darkness that could become illuminated if you shifted your attention, but that remains invisible as long as you don't attend to it. The implications are striking. Your reality is not given, but selected. By directing attention, you actively choose what aspects of the world you'll be conscious of. Two people in the same physical situation can have completely different conscious experiences, depending on where they direct attention. And because attention is limited, much of the world passes by unnoticed, invisible, not because it's not there, but because you're not attending to it. Individual differences in perceived reality. No two brains are exactly alike, and this means no two people experience reality in exactly the same way. Beyond normal variation in perception, some individuals have conditions that dramatically alter their perceptual experience, revealing just how much of a reality is constructed internally. Prosopagnosia, or face blindness, is a condition where people cannot recognize faces, even though they can see them clearly. Some people with prosopagnosia can't recognize their own family members by their faces and must use other cues like voice, gait, or clothing. The condition results from damage to or dysfunction in the fusiform face area, a brain region specialized for face processing. This shows that face recognition is a specific ability that can be selectively impaired. Faces don't just automatically register as familiar when you see them. Your brain actively processes facial features and compares them to stored representations. When this system is damaged, faces become meaningless patterns. Visual form agnosia is an inability to recognize objects based on their shape. People with this condition can see colors and textures, and their basic visual processing is intact. But they can't perceive forms and shapes well enough to identify objects. They might be shown an apple and be unable to recognize it as an apple. Even though they can describe its color and texture, if allowed to touch it, they can immediately recognize it, showing that their knowledge of objects is intact, but access through vision is impaired. Agnosia demonstrates that perception is not a single unified process, but a collection of specialized subsystems. You can have perfectly functioning early visual processing, but still be unable to recognize objects if the higher level recognition systems are damaged. Conversely, you can have impaired early vision, but intact object recognition under certain conditions. This modularity reveals that seeing an object involves many distinct steps, each of which can be selectively disrupted. Aphantasia is the inability to voluntarily visualize mental images. When most people close their eyes and think of an apple, they can visualize it, seeing a mental image of an apple's shape and color. People with aphantasia have no visual imagery. Their mind's eye is, in effect, blind. If you ask them to imagine an apple, they know what an apple is and can describe it verbally, but they experience no visual imagery. This condition was only recently recognized as a distinct phenomenon in scientific literature, and research is still ongoing to determine its true prevalence. Current estimates suggest it might affect somewhere between 1 and 3% of the population, though these numbers may be refined as researchers develop better assessment methods and conduct larger studies. Conversely, some people have hyperphantasia, the ability to generate extremely vivid mental imagery that rivals or even surpasses actual perception in its detail. For these individuals, imagining a scene can be almost like seeing it. They can visualize entire landscapes with photographic detail. This shows that the capacity for mental imagery varies along a continuum, from absent to overwhelming, and this variation shapes how people think and remember. Color perception varies more than you might think, even among people with normal color vision. The number of different colors you can distinguish, the boundaries you draw between color categories, and even the emotional associations with colors are all influenced by culture, language, and individual experience. Some languages have fewer basic color terms than English, while others have more. These linguistic differences correlate with perceptual differences. If your language doesn't distinguish between blue and green, you may be slightly slower at discriminating blue from green shades because you're not in the habit of attending to that boundary. Pain perception varies enormously between individuals. The same stimulus that one person finds moderately painful, another might find excruciating. This variation has both biological and psychological components. Some people have genetic variants that make them more or less sensitive to pain. Others have learned responses based on past experiences. Cultural factors also play a role. Some cultures encourage stoic responses to pain, while others are more accepting of pain expression. All of this means that pain is not a simple reflection of tissue damage, but a complex perception shaped by biology, psychology, and culture. Smell perception varies more between individuals than almost any other sense. A large percentage of the genes in your genome code for olfactory receptors, and there's substantial genetic variation in these receptors. Some people have specific anosmias, the inability to smell particular odors, while being able to smell everything else normally. One person might be unable to smell the scent of roses, while another can't smell the odor of rotting meat. This means that the olfactory world you experience is partly unique to you, determined by your particular set of functional receptor genes. Cultural factors shape perception in fundamental ways. People from Western cultures tend to focus attention on foreground objects and analyze scenes in terms of individual components. People from East Asian cultures tend to attend more to context and relationships, seeing scenes more holistically. These attentional habits affect not just how people describe scenes, but what they literally see and remember. When shown the same image, people from different cultural backgrounds will have different memories of it, noticing and remembering different aspects. Expectations shape perception so strongly that they can override sensory input. This is demonstrated in the placebo effect for pain. If you're told that a cream will reduce pain, it actually does reduce the pain you experience, even if the cream is inert. This happens because your expectation of pain relief activates the brain's endogenous pain control systems, reducing the pain signal before it reaches consciousness. The pain is not imaginary. You genuinely feel less pain. Your expectation has changed your perceptual reality. Context affects virtually every aspect of perception. The same food tastes different depending on the setting in which you eat it, the company you're with, and your expectations about the food. The same music sounds different in a concert hall versus on headphones versus as background in a store. The same image looks different depending on what surrounds it. None of these contexts change the sensory input, the food, the sound waves, the light patterns, but they change your experience because perception is always constructed in context, integrating the immediate stimulus with everything else you know and expect. Individual differences in perception mean that people genuinely live in different realities. Not entirely different, of course. There's enough overlap that communication is possible, that we can agree on many things. But the qualitative character of your experience, the felt texture of your reality, is partly unique to you. When you describe seeing a color, tasting a food, or hearing music, you can never be entirely sure that your experience matches another person's experience, even if you use the same words. The private, subjective nature of perception creates an inherent limit to shared understanding, the limits of knowing reality. After exploring all these facts about perception and reality, a natural question arises. Can we ever know objective reality as it truly is, independent of our perceptual systems? Or are we forever trapped behind the veil of our senses, experiencing only our brain's constructed model of the world? Immanuel Kant addressed this question in the 18th century, distinguishing between phenomena, the world as we experience it, and noumena, the world as it is in itself. Kant argued that we can never know noumena. All our knowledge is filtered through the structures of perception and cognition, which shape experience in fundamental ways. Space and time themselves, Kant argued, are not properties of the world in itself, but forms imposed by our minds on sensory experience. Modern neuroscience supports a version of this view. As we've seen, perception is not direct, but constructed. The world you experience is your brain's model, not the world itself. This model is constrained by sensory input, so it's not pure fiction. But it's also not a transparent window onto objective reality. It's a pragmatic representation, designed by evolution not to reveal truth, but to promote survival and reproduction. Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist, takes this idea even further with a provocative theoretical framework. He argues that evolution does not necessarily favor accurate perception, but rather useful perception. Just as a computer desktop interface hides the complexity of the underlying computer operations behind simple icons and buttons, he proposes that perception might hide the complexity of reality behind simple objects and properties that we can manipulate effectively. The desktop interface is not meant to reveal the underlying reality of transistors and electrons, but it's useful for interacting with the computer. Hoffman suggests our perceptual interface might work similarly, not revealing fundamental reality, but providing useful tools for interacting with the world. If this framework were correct, then space, time, and physical objects might not correspond to anything in ultimate reality. but could be merely useful representations in our perceptual interface. This is certainly a radical claim, and it remains highly debated among scientists and philosophers, but it follows from taking seriously the idea that perception evolved for fitness rather than truth. However, there are limits to how far perception can diverge from reality. If your perceptual model were completely unmoored from reality, you couldn't navigate the world successfully. The fact that we can manipulate objects, predict events, and build technology that works reliably suggests that our perceptual model captures some structure of the real world, even if it's not a perfect copy. The map is not the territory, but a useful map must correspond to the territory in important ways. Thomas Nagel argued that the subjective character of experience is not capturable by objective science. Science proceeds by developing explanations that are independent of any particular perspective, explanations that anyone could verify. But the subjective character of experience, the what it's likeness, is inherently perspectival. It's inseparable from the point of view of the experiencing subject. This means that a complete objective science might be able to explain all the functional aspects of the mind and brain, but it could never fully account for consciousness, for what it's like to be you. This suggests that there may be two complementary ways of knowing reality: objective and subjective. Objective knowledge is public, verifiable, and independent of perspective. It's the domain of science. Subjective knowledge is private, direct, and bound to a particular perspective. It's the domain of conscious experience. Neither can be reduced to the other. Both are real and important, but they offer different kinds of access to reality. The limits of perception also raise questions about the reality of the external world. How do you know there is an external world at all, rather than just your perceptual experience? This is the ancient problem of skepticism about the external world. You might be a brain in a vat, fed artificial sensory inputs that create the illusion of a world. Or you might be dreaming, or the world might have popped into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with all your memories and all the evidence of a long history. These skeptical scenarios are unfalsifiable. No evidence could prove them wrong, because any evidence would itself be part of the experience you're trying to escape. Most philosophers and scientists reject these scenarios as unproductive, preferring to assume that there is a real external world, that causes our sensory experiences. But the skeptical scenarios do highlight a deep point. Your most fundamental beliefs about reality, including the existence of an external world, are not based on proof, but on pragmatic commitments. You assume there's a world because that assumption is useful and makes sense of your experience, not because you have airtight evidence for it. The constructed nature of perception also raises questions about free will. If your conscious experience is always slightly delayed, being assembled after initial neural processing, what does this mean for voluntary action? Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s showed that certain patterns of brain activity associated with voluntary actions begin several hundred milliseconds before people report consciously deciding to act. This finding sparked intense debate about whether conscious will might be, in some sense, constructed after the fact by your brain. However, interpreting these experiments remains highly controversial. Some researchers argue that conscious awareness and the ability to report a decision are not the same thing, and that the conscious process of deciding might actually be occurring during the preparatory brain activity, even if the reportable awareness comes later. Others have suggested that conscious will might operate less by initiating actions and more by approving or vetoing them, with unconscious processes preparing options that consciousness then selects among. The relationship between consciousness and action remains an open and actively debated question in neuroscience and philosophy. The fact that perception is constructed doesn't mean that reality is arbitrary, or that all beliefs are equally valid. Some constructions correspond more closely to the world than others. Some are more useful, more coherent, more predictive. Science is a method for developing better constructions, for refining our models to match reality more closely. But science itself is a human activity, constrained by our perceptual and cognitive limitations. Scientific theories are not perfect mirrors of reality, but our best current approximations, always subject to revision. One of the most profound implications of understanding perception is epistemic humility. If your experience of reality is constructed by your brain, filtered through the limitations of your senses, and shaped by your past experiences and current expectations, then you should be humble about your certainty. What seems obvious to you might seem different to someone else, not because they're wrong, but because their brain is constructing a different model. When people disagree about what they perceive or remember, it's often not that someone is lying or stupid, but that they're genuinely experiencing different constructed realities. This doesn't lead to radical relativism where all views are equally correct. There are still facts about the world, and some perceptual constructions are more accurate than others. But it does suggest that we should be more charitable in understanding disagreement, more curious about other perspectives, and more aware of the provisional nature of our own perceptions. Your reality is not the reality. It's a reality, one among many, and there may be aspects of the world that your particular perceptual and cognitive systems cannot access. The limits of perception also open up possibilities for expanding our reality. Technologies like virtual reality can create entirely new perceptual experiences, patterns of sensory input that have never existed in natural environments. Brain-computer interfaces might one day allow us to perceive new kinds of information, extending our senses beyond the biological limitations we've inherited. If perception is constructed, then by changing the inputs in the construction process, we might be able to construct entirely new realities, experiences that would have been impossible for our evolutionary ancestors. In the end, the study of perception reveals both humility and power. Humility in recognizing that our access to reality is limited, filtered, and constructed. Power in understanding that we're not passive recipients of reality, but active constructors, and that by understanding the construction process, we might gain some control over it. You live in a world of your brain's making, but it's a shared world, constrained by physics and biology, and shaped by evolution. It's a world rich enough to support everything you experience, everything you know, and everything you can imagine. Conclusion. And now, as your thoughts begin to soften and drift, let's pause to consider where we've been. We've journeyed through the constructed world of perception, exploring how your brain builds reality from incomplete information, how time bends and stretches in your subjective experience, how colors are inventions rather than discoveries, how memories reconstruct the past rather than replaying it. We've touched on the deep mystery of consciousness itself, the puzzle of why there's something it's like to be you. We've seen how synesthesia reveals the arbitrary boundaries between senses, how attention shapes what enters your awareness, and how individual differences mean that no two people experience quite the same reality. These 100 facts about reality and perception point to a single profound truth. The world you experience is not the world as it is, but the world as your brain interprets it. This doesn't make your experience less real or less meaningful. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. Your brain, that 3-pound organ housed in darkness and silence, receives only electrical signals from your senses. Yet from these signals, it constructs the rich, vivid, coherent experience of a world. Every color you see, Every sound you hear, every sensation you feel, is created inside your skull. You are, in a very real sense, living in a waking dream, a controlled hallucination, a simulation that your brain runs based on patterns of neural activity. But this controlled hallucination usually matches reality closely enough to be useful. You can catch a ball, navigate a crowded street, recognize a friend's face, even though all of these require your brain to solve incredibly complex, computational problems in real time. The constructed nature of perception is not a bug, but a feature. It allows your brain to filter out irrelevant information, to predict and prepare for what's coming next, to fill in gaps and maintain stable percepts despite constantly changing sensory input. Understanding that perception is constructed has practical implications. It can make you more patient with others who see things differently, more aware of your own cognitive biases, more skeptical of your certainty. It can help you appreciate the limits of your senses and the possibility that there are aspects of reality you cannot directly perceive. It might even help you be more mindful, more aware of the present moment, recognizing that your experience of now is itself a construction, assembled from past sensations and predictive models. As you drift towards sleep, you might notice your perception beginning to fragment, to lose its coherence. The boundary between waking and dreaming is itself a construction, maintained by certain patterns of brain activity. When those patterns change, the construction changes, and you enter a different kind of reality, one where the normal rules of physics and causation don't apply, where you can fly or breathe underwater or meet impossible beings. Dreams are your brain's constructions freed from the constraints of sensory input, revealing the creative, generative capacity that's always there, even when you're awake. In a way, understanding perception is understanding yourself. You are not separate from your perceptions. You are a process of perception, a continuous flow of constructed experience. The you that feels like a unified, continuous self is itself a construction, a story your brain tells to integrate disparate experiences into a coherent narrative. This doesn't make you an illusion, but it does complicate the question of what you are. Tonight, as you rest, your brain will continue its work, consolidating memories, processing emotions, preparing for tomorrow. Even in sleep, your constructed reality persists, taking new and stranger forms. The hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved, the nature of qualia still mysterious. But whatever consciousness is, wherever subjective experience comes from, you have it. You are it. And that's perhaps the most remarkable fact of all. So rest now, secure in the knowledge that your brain will continue building your reality, that when you wake, the world will be there, solid and vivid and full of meaning, even though it's all constructed from neural firing patterns in a dark, silent box. The constructed nature of reality doesn't diminish its wonder. If anything, it deepens it. You live inside a miracle of computational neuroscience, a self-sustaining hallucination that's so reliable, so coherent, so useful, that you rarely notice it's a construction at all. And if you enjoyed this journey through the science of perception, if these explorations helped you unwind or gave you something interesting to ponder as you drift off to sleep, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one curious mind at a time. Until next time, sleep well, dream vividly, and remember that the reality you wake to is your brain's most extraordinary creation. Good night.